You know, in structural engineering, we talk about strong column, weak beam. So how do you take that concept and apply it to personal development?
Oh, this is a great question. So going back to this kind of engineering yourself first, my experience with engineers, because I am one, is that we love math and physics and problem solving and those types of things. I didn't want to come into this conference when I pitched this idea speaking about something that didn't have any connection. And I thought there's this concept of strong column, weak beam. The beam is weaker relative to the column, but I think as engineers, we understand.
Did you know that nearly 50% of engineering professionals feel overwhelmed by career demands, many struggling to find a balance between personal and professional growth? What if the key to long-term success in engineering isn't just technical skills, but building a strong personal foundation? In today's episode, I'm thrilled to welcome Jake Kennington. He's a PE and SE, a senior engineer at Reaveley Engineers, and the owner and coach at Human Engineer Coach. He's also the author of a children's book. We're going to explore how principles like stability and resilience can transform not only structures, but also your career path. Get ready to discover why engineering yourself first might be the most essential blueprint for your success. I'm your host, Rachel Holland, and this is the Structural Engineering Channel.
This episode of the Structural Engineering Channel is brought to you by PPI, a leader in engineering exam prep for the PE structural exam. PPI provides expert prep courses and study resources designed to help you pass the PE structural exam the first time. PPI's PE structural course is fully updated and taught with October 2021 code references and includes new editions of their PE structural books. PPI's live online courses include hours of lectures, problem-solving demonstrations, exam strategy sessions, office hours, and a passing guarantee. When you take a live online course, PPI guarantees you will pass, or you can take the on-demand course for free. PPI has helped engineers achieve their licensing goals since 1975. Check out PPI today at PPI2pass.com to see all of the resources available for PE structural exam prep. Again, that's PPI2pass.com.
Hi, Jake. Thanks so much for joining us today. I was hoping that we could start by you telling us a little bit about yourself and how you came about your role as the senior engineer at Reaveley Engineers. And also, I want to hear more about the whole personal development coach part.
Awesome. I'd be happy to do it. I want to say thanks for having me on the podcast. It's good to meet you, Rachel. And I've been listening to quite a few previous episodes. I love what you and Matt are doing, and so happy to be here. But my experience is that most of us, if not all of us, wear many different hats. I know we're structural engineers, and that's what we do by day. But I'm also a husband, a father of 4, kids ages 1 to 10. I'm a structural engineer, like I said, and I'm also a personal development coach and just recently added children's book author to one of the hats that I wear. And so I think we're all multifaceted and multidimensional, and we have a lot going on. And I know today we're going to talk a little bit more about engineering and some of those things, and I'd love to share my story. I think the easiest way to start off is to explain kind of my past experience in structural engineering. And so I graduated from college in 2014 from Fresno State. I interned with a company there locally in Fresno, California for 2 years, 2 summers, and then ended up working for them for 10 years after that. And it was a phenomenal experience. It was a small firm. There was only 4 or 5 engineers, a couple of CAD staff, but it was local. It was friendly. I'm really, really good friends with a lot of those guys still to this day. But at some point, I kind of woke up and thought, it's been 10 years. What do I want for the next 10 years? And had to have kind of some hard conversations with my wife and myself and my current boss and some of my coworkers that were really good friends of mine. And ultimately decided that the only way I could sum it up at the time was I wanted more. And personally, to be honest, I didn't even know what that meant. But looking back on it, the last 2 or 3 years, I kind of wanted more opportunities for growth, more challenge. I wanted to be able to see different leadership styles, a range of engineering backgrounds. Like I said, the firm that I was at, although it was great, it was small. And so you're kind of limited in maybe some of the mindsets of the individuals there. And then I wanted to work on different types of projects. And so I made the hard decision to switch jobs after being somewhere for almost 12 years, right? And it was difficult, but my wife and I knew that that's what we needed to do. And so the end of 2022, we ended up moving from Fresno, California to Salt Lake City, Utah, to work with Reaveley Engineers. And it's been a wonderful experience. It's been everything that I hoped for and more. It's also been very difficult. The firm is, 60 strong. And so it's at this next level of what I consider in terms of size and types of projects that we're working on. And so it's been really great. And I do want to point out that in that time frame, the last couple of years, I had just passed the SE exam, which anybody that's done that knows that that's just a mountain to climb and very difficult. It takes a lot of effort and work and studying. And so I just passed that exam. I kind of, for the previous decade, had this kind of guideline of where to go with college, and then interning, and then working, and then passing the exam. And then all of a sudden I found myself thinking, well, now what? Right. And
so wait, just to make sure I got the timeline of it right.
Sure.
You left Fresno and that job and moved to Salt Lake City and took on the new company. That was all in one move just a couple of years ago?
Yeah, good point.
Okay.
So this was 2023. I had just had my fourth child with my wife. I had just passed the SE exam. And normally you think that'd be a time of celebration, that we'd be happy and we're like, oh, we can finally settle in and just relax and kind of coast. But I found the opposite to be true. I found that I was like kind of itching for something new and didn't know what was next. And it felt a little uncomfortable. And so anyways, we ended up making the move and looking for another job, and it was great. But with that, I think in that time period, there was this change of focus for me that was a little less inward, as far as like climbing the corporate ladder, looking for a promotion, getting the license, like working on me and in my career. And I had a shift in focus to be a little bit more outward. What I wanted to do was to create something that I was in charge of outside of my career that I could help other people with. And so ultimately what I ended up doing is I wrote this children's book for my son. We put it up on Amazon. It's been a great experience. I'm writing a few more books. And then earlier this year, I also started a coaching program to be a personal coach for other engineers. And it's been a whirlwind. It's been pretty crazy learning that business, but it's been really fun. So that's where I'm at right now.
Awesome. Okay. So I also worked for a small company when I was still doing consulting work. So I totally understand what you're talking about. You just don't get exposure to
Sure.
as many different, like you said, leadership styles or just different projects as maybe you would in a bigger firm. But like you said, there are aspects of working for a smaller firm where you also get exposure to like everything. Whereas whereas like when you work for a big company, sometimes I think you can get focused in on a group that does this type of project or things like that.
Exactly.
So,
I think
I
the small
understand.
firm, everybody does a little bit of everything, I think. And so I love my roots. I love that I worked there first. I would highly suggest to maybe younger engineers to start that way, to start off small. And if they feel the urge to go work for a bigger company, then to do so. But I'm really happy with how my career ended up at this point. So
Right. So how did the idea of engineering yourself first become a central focus for you? And on that same line of thought, how do you see it paralleling the principles of structural engineering in building a stable, resilient career?
So this is interesting. Engineering yourself first is kind of this thing that happened over years of just my own personal experience, like I shared with switching firms, moving 700-800 miles away from my childhood home. And so it's a lot of things that I've just kind of learned along the way. But what happened was after we had moved to Salt Lake City, I'm working for Reaveley Engineers. I've been there for about a year. I go to this 2-day conference. Here it's called SEAU, the Structural Engineers Association of Utah. California has SEOC. And so they do an annual conference every year. It's 2 days long. I went to it last year. It tends to be very technical. People are up there talking about case studies and certain earthquakes that happened and how buildings performed and the new cutting technology and software and things like that. Obviously, we're all technical in our careers, but I found that there was something lacking because I think almost 100% of the presentations were uber technical and obviously geared towards structural engineers. But I left that conference thinking I could speak at this and I could share something. And I don't know what it would be, but I could share something. And so for the last several months, I've kind of been kicking around the idea of if I were to speak at this conference, it's a 60 or 90 minute slot, what would I share? And through, again, my personal experience and my journey through my career, and also through this coaching program that I do, I came up with this idea of engineering yourself first and making sure that we're more well-rounded and that we're taking care of things that are important, like our mental and physical, spiritual health, and that we're not just engineers. Although that's a big role in our lives, I think we can get kind of one-dimensional. I've been guilty of that over the last decade or so, of sinking most of my time, my effort into my career. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, but I think when we neglect these other parts of our lives, we have things like burnout or we feel stuck or we're just not as happy as we could be. And so I personally have made it a focus to kind of focus on my family and my health and all these other things and engineer myself first, and then have my career in a weird way kind of come second. And so, again, this was just an idea to pitch to this conference to be like, hey, if I were to speak, I would do this. And so I think it was about a month or two ago, I sent in an abstract with this idea, engineer yourself first. And it was only 300 words. It was very short. It was just an idea. And I heard back from them, I think it was last week, that they said, yeah, let's do it. And so they're interested, again, at a very technical, high level engineering conference. I'm going to be the speaker that's the least technical or maybe even non-technical speaker. So I'm excited, but I think it's super important.
I think congratulations on that. I think that's
Thanks.
great. You'll probably have the highest attended section. I don't know if you did you go to the SEAT convention when it was in Indian Wells, Palm Springs, like 2022?
I wish I would have. That sounds awesome.
I feel like they did a lot during that convention. I don't know if they're doing it in Utah, but in California now they have this, like, it's a pathways so it's like for like the younger engineers, they kind of have like some other sessions or whatever it's called, geared towards the pathways group, and just awesome. Different kind of things for them. And that was a big thing that was talked about, like the burnout and just career path, and like, being still like kind of being true to yourself and not like realizing, your career doesn't necessarily need to be linear, and you might take risks and go a different direction. And anyway, it was actually, I thought it was great. So I think your topic's going to be awesome. And I really do think it's going to be highly attended. So,
well, I appreciate that. I've learned through coaching and coworkers and just talking to people and being on podcasts, things like this, that people are hungry for these kinds of topics, right? I think we're kind of lacking because we've neglected these things for a little bit, maybe for too long. And so I really hope so.
Why do you think that engineers prioritize like their professional stuff over their personal growth? And I mean, obviously you've experienced the imbalance. I've experienced the imbalance to make you, see it and kind of make some changes. But what do you think are the risks of that?
So I think the main reason behind that is that our professional skills, like we talked about with our college degrees and getting licensed and working late hours and learning the building, doing all these things, that they feel very urgent. And I think they feel urgent because they feel tangible and measurable. And as engineers, we like that. We can kind of gauge the progress, right? But I think some of these other things, like our personal development and focusing on engineering our lives and the lives we want to live, they feel important, I think is the right word. But sometimes those important things feel like, oh, I can get to those tomorrow, right? Whereas we got to answer that email right now, or we have to get that project done by the deadline, or I need to get this license because then I'll get paid more, or whatever it is. And so I think there's this weird conundrum between what's urgent and what's important. And I think what's urgent usually rises to the top just naturally, and we really have to fight back and figure out what's important and put those things first. So I think that's kind of, at least my experience has been that I often address the low-hanging urgent fruit, so to speak, first, and we kind of need to make this concerted effort to put what's important first.
Yeah, that's a really good, I really like that a lot. Like you're distinguishing between what's urgent and what's actually important. And those are two totally different things oftentimes.
Yeah, for sure.
What about, in structural engineering, we talk about strong column, weak beam, right? So how do you take that concept and apply it to personal development?
Oh, this is a great question. So going back to this kind of engineering yourself first, my experience with engineers, because I am one, is that we're quirky and we're engineers and we kind of like what we like, and we love math and physics and problem solving and those types of things. And so I didn't want to come into this conference when I pitched this idea speaking about something that didn't have any connection back to engineering, right? And so I thought about it a lot, and I thought there's this concept of strong column, weak beam, which, by the way, I hate the name of the concept. We don't ever design anything to be weak, right? I think it might be better suited to call it strong beam, stronger column, because it's about relativity, right? The beam is weaker relative to the column. But I think as engineers, we understand that ultimately what we're trying to do is ensure the stability of a building or a structure, especially in an event like a seismic event or a strong wind event. And we do that by prioritizing the integrity of the column over the beam, right? So if the beam fails, it's not great, but it's not catastrophic. If the column comes down, we have bigger problems, right?
Right.
And so I think there's a metaphor there. I think there's a lesson to be learned that's applicable just in general life, that if we strengthen our columns of personal development, and what that means to me is doing things like cultivating self-discipline, enhancing self-awareness, and fostering creativity, is that we make these foundations or these supports, these strong columns that other things can be supported on, like our careers, our families, and ultimately our overall well-being. And so, again, I'm an engineer, so that makes sense to me. And it's like, okay, yeah, I can see how that's important. I think some of the fundamentals of what we're talking about, and I teach this in my coaching practice, are things like mastering a morning routine. I talk a lot about reflective writing and journaling, and then also engaging in creative pursuits outside of work. I think it's important that we do some of these things outside of our day-to-day job. And I think that's how we build resilient personal foundations. And I think that's just really important for all of us to put effort into.
Yeah. I feel like a lot of engineers that I meet are very creative outside of work.
Yeah.
Like they have hobbies that are just always super interesting to me, and they have a creative element to them. So sure. I think that's great. What about, can you explain the idea of like you just mentioned for your coaching, you talk about having a morning routine. So the idea of owning the morning and how starting the day with a personal time that can positively impact your day. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, for sure. This is something that all these things that I share, and I've kind of already mentioned this, but things that I've gained through personal experience, kind of lessons learned. I'm not a morning person. I'm the last person to be telling anybody to wake up early and do some of these things. But I've found that, like you said, the people that I most admire, engineers, family members, friends, neighbors, whoever they are, the people that I look up to, I've also found that they kind of tend to have these same things in their lives. They make it a focus in the morning to get the important things done, right? They write often. They're always creating, like you said. Other engineers, you feel like they have these hobbies and they're very creative outside of their jobs. And so I've kind of seen that in other individuals and admired that about them, and then tried to take those lessons learned from others and then apply them in my own lives. And so I think as far as owning the morning goes, I think one of the best things you can do for building this strong column or this strong foundation is to spend time in the morning for you. I think it goes back to the idea of prioritizing what's important over what's urgent. I've been guilty for many, many years of literally just rolling out of bed and going straight to work and driving 15 minutes down the road and still being half asleep by the time I walk through the door. But for the last little bit, several months and even years now, I've been trying to wake up early and get the things done that are important. I think the biggest lie in the world is I'll do it tomorrow. But I think the second biggest lie is I'll do it after I get home from work. And so we all say that. We all say we'll do it tomorrow. And then we all say, well, I'll go to the gym after work, or I'll, read or write or whatever is important to us. We'll do it later, right? And so I just think it's so important that in the morning we set aside time to work on mental, emotional, physical, spiritual health. They're perhaps the most important things. And again, there's this idea of something being important, but we don't get to it because it doesn't feel urgent.
Right.
So if we're not careful and we're not intentional, then those things kind of take a backseat to our careers. And then a couple other things I would add to owning the morning is that I try not to touch the TV, my phone, or emails for the first 2 hours that I'm awake. I think that's
How early are you waking up?
Well, so you bring up a good point. Lately, I've been waking up at 5. And again,
okay.
I'm not a morning person. People listening to this are probably like, what are you talking about? You wake up at 5 a.m.?
And with a 1-year-old? You said you have a 1-year-old? So
I have a 1-year-old.
Yeah.
And so I will say this. Take these concepts, whoever's listening, and apply them to your life in whatever way makes sense. I have a 1-year-old, a 3-year-old, a 7 and a 10-year-old. So if I don't do it in the morning before they're awake, these things will not happen.
Right.
Because not only do I have work, but then I come home and there's dinner time and sports and, everything else and bedtime routines, and 10 o'clock at night, I'm just not jumping on the treadmill. Like, it's not happening. And so take the concept, apply it to your life, whatever makes sense. But I wake up at 5 and I do 3 things. I read, I write, and I run. I've had friends that go, oh, the 3 R's. That's great. And I'm like, well, there's one that's a W in there, but it sounds like 3 R's.
Yeah.
And so those are the 3 things that I've found that help me stay sane and that keep me physically healthy. And I think it's so important, because when we're physically healthy, just everything else in our life kind of fires the right pace, right? And so, yeah, that's kind of what Own the Morning is. It's take time to do the things that don't feel urgent, that could always be put off till tomorrow or after work, and slide them to the front of the day and make sure that those things get done first.
Yeah, that's great. I love that. You've mentioned a few times about journaling. So you encourage engineers to write to think, and how does that contribute to self-awareness?
Awesome. You have great questions. I've journaled off and on throughout my life, probably more off than on. But in the last 4 years, and what's funny about the pandemic that happened in 2020 is I think we all had a lot more time. And so we started doing more of these things that we're talking about, hobbies and being creative. People read more and wrote more and started journaling. Flash forward a couple years, I think we've kind of let some of those things slide back to what was normal before, myself included. But since 2020, I've made an effort to journal, not necessarily daily, but pretty frequently. And I would argue that daily is probably preferred. But I think we're just so busy, not only busy with work, but if you have a family with kids and sports and every second in between, when we have downtime, we're on Instagram or Facebook or whatever it may be, or we're watching a YouTube video, or we have AirPods in or headphones in, and we just don't take time to slow down and think. And so if you've ever tried to sit down and write in a journal or any form of writing, you quickly find out that it's pretty difficult to gather your thoughts and put them on paper. And it's incredibly difficult to do it if you have the TV on or music play or different things happening. And so for me, the easiest way, or one of the best ways to slow down, is to sit down and write, and to use that time to think and gather your thoughts, develop self-awareness, journal about things that are happening in your life and in conversations that you have with friends, things that you're learning, whether that's inside or outside of your career. There's a great author. He's about my age. His name's Ryan Holiday, and I love what he writes. He writes a lot about Stoic philosophy, but he has this quote. He says, "This is what the best journals look like. They aren't for the reader. They are for the writer, to slow down the mind, to wage peace with oneself." And I love that. I've never thought of waging peace. We always think of waging war, right?
Yeah.
But you're kind of like, it's this inner battle that we all have, this inner talk about all day long we talk to ourselves, and it's helpful, I've found, to take those thoughts and put them on paper and kind of use that writing process to refine your thinking. It's easier just to have that little voice in your head, but it's much harder to like concretely write down what you're thinking, because a lot of times you erase it or you rewrite it or you edit it, and then you end up with something like, yes, this is what I think and this is what I believe and this is what's important.
Yeah, and if it's just in your head, oftentimes it's fleeting, like
yes,
you can't
very
really,
fleeting.
You don't remember. So do you have like practical tips on how you can incorporate this habit?
Oh, for sure. I think whatever's best for you, like do what works best, but I'll share what I do, and people may take this and run with it, or maybe it sparks another idea. But I'll tell you, I am an engineer. My journal is an Excel spreadsheet. I have a column that has the date and the column that has the entry for the day. And I keep it on my phone because, like you just said, these thoughts are kind of fleeting sometimes. And so what happens during the day is something happens that's different than most days, whatever it may be. It could be a conversation with a coworker. It could be experience with one of my kids. It could be something big, something small. It could be passing an exam. It could be landing a new job. It could be any of those things. But a lot of times, if you sit down at the end of the day to write, you go, what even happened today? Like, I don't even know. And so a lot of times in the middle of the day when something like that happens, I just pull out my phone and I write one sentence just to remind me of that little thing that was super important. And then later I'll go back and kind of elaborate a little bit. And so that's what I've found to be helpful. Anyone that's not used to journaling, what I would say is find a way that works for you, commit to do it for the next 10 days, whatever that looks like for you, and then adapt, right? If it's not working and you need to find a different time to do it or a different way to do it, if you need to write physically versus digitally or whatever it is, just try it and then make it important, whether that's in the morning or at night or whatever it may be. But what works for me is I tend to just write a little something down in the middle of the day, whatever that is. And I'll give you a quick example. So last week, my wife's grandpa passed away. He was 91, 92 years old. So it was kind of expected he was getting to that age. But we went to the funeral. We went to the gravesite. We sat with family. We mourned. We remembered his life. And it was a really great experience. And I think we all tend to think that we'll remember those feelings and those conversations and what happened forever. But then what happens is the next day we go back to work and, everything happens and we go back to normal life, and then we forget those sweet, tender moments. And so, that day I wrote just about what had happened and who I spoke with and the memories that I had with him. And anyways, part of journaling is the actual writing and thinking through your thoughts. But the other part of journaling is reading those things later. And I think it's pretty helpful.
I haven't done an actual journal like you're talking about, but I did a few years back. I read, it was called The Happiness Project, I think.
Sure.
And she talks about keeping a gratitude journal.
Yeah.
And so
great.
I did something similar in my phone. I would have like my notes and I would just pop little things in there throughout the day to remember. And then at the end of the day, I could go in and like talk about those moments that made me feel grateful for whatever was happening.
Yeah.
But it's true, if you don't do it in the moment, like you're talking about, and just jot something quickly, the end of the day, again, that thought is just, it's gone from your head kind of. You can't remember it.
Yeah. I think to your point about the gratitude journal, oftentimes if you're new to journaling or writing in general and you sit and you just stare at a blank page or a blank screen, it's difficult. You're kind of like, well, I don't want to just chronologically log what happened throughout the day. That's boring, right? You don't want to, I woke up, I went to work, there's no point or value that I can see in really doing that. But if you have a purpose like gratitude, or what I use is a prompt, I don't always answer this question, but at the top of my Excel spreadsheet, it says, what is the moment from this day that has made it different from other days? And obviously on a day like a funeral day with my wife's grandpa, you're going to write about that. Like that's a huge moment, right? But there's other days that just seem like a regular Tuesday, and you're like, what happened today that was like different than any other day? And I found that prompt to be helpful because it really makes me kind of look at the day. And it's not only when I sit down to write in my journal at night or in the morning, but it's throughout the day. Like you said, I'm mindful of that question. And when something kind of unique happens, again, big or small, I jump on my phone and I just write a quick sentence. And so that it just helps to keep track of things. So
yeah, I love that tip. How do you encourage finding creative outlets outside of work? Is this something you do in your coaching as well, encouraging people to do this?
100%. We talked about how, there's other people that you just, and sometimes we don't even know why, but you look up to and you admire and you go, I want to be like that person. Again, it could be a coworker, a family member, a spouse, a parent, whoever it may be. And it makes us curious. We want to know, like, what are they doing that I'm not doing? And I found that a lot of people that I look up to are doing exactly what you said. They're doing something outside of their careers. It's very creative. And I think that creativity can be what we tend to think of like artsy. It can be music or painting or things like that, which I am not musical. I am not artistic. And I used to tell myself that I'm not creative because I'm not artistic. I like straight lines and math, and I'm an engineer. But I think creativity can be a lot of different things. I like to cook. I write children's books. I'm working on a few more. We create businesses. We create families. We build a lot of different things. But what I focus on in my coaching is being intentional with these creative kind of projects, to the point that you don't have to, but I think it's helpful that when you create something, you're doing it first and foremost for yourself, kind of like writing, like I spoke about, but also that there's this added benefit of you can share it with other people, which I think is part of what being human is this creating and sharing. And I think we just need to lean more into that.
Definitely. What about, do you feel like these creative outlets outside of work, do you think that they help engineers like align better with their values? And then, I mean, how do you feel like it changes the perspective that they bring to work every day?
Sure. So my experience with writing my children's book, I'll share a little bit more about that, and hopefully this sheds some light on your question. It started out with just, I'm going to write a children's book for my son to teach him something that I thought was really important. And so I wrote the book, and then you quickly realize, well, I can't draw this thing, so I've got to find an illustrator. And so then I start looking online for an illustrator, and that took some time. And then there was some back and forth between us, and I kind of played the role of architect. I didn't draw it. I didn't format it. My brother helped me with that. There's a lot of things I didn't do, but I was kind of leading the charge. I had the vision. I was paying for it. Like, I had skin in the game, right? Like, this was my baby. And I never knew what was going to come of it. I thought I'd just have this cute book on the shelf and my son would enjoy it, and maybe he'd pass it on to his son or his kids in the future. But some really neat experiences that I never could have predicted came from that. So he started writing his own book. He was 9 years old at the time. And he didn't tell us, but he just started writing his own book, which was really awesome. This is a kid that went to speech classes when he was younger. He didn't speak till much later. He's always struggled with, English and writing and these other things. And here he is, like, writing this book. Like, I never would have guessed, and it's actually pretty good. And so we're working on finishing that up, and maybe we'll get somebody to illustrate it and go that route. My mom is also a school teacher, so I sent her a copy of the book, and she read it to her first grade class. And the video was really cool. If you know anything about first graders, they're pretty rambunctious, and it's hard for them to sit still. And she read this book for 5 minutes, and they all sat there, and they were captivated. And she asked them questions afterwards, like to see if they understood what the lesson was and what was going on, and they did. And so that was really a sweet experience to watch that video. And then my current company, Reaveley, what's awesome about Reaveley is they're very supportive of these other kind of extracurricular things that we do. And they realize that we're not just engineers, right? And so we do a lot of work with K through 12 schools around here in Salt Lake City and Utah County. And so we were doing this marketing event. It wasn't an engineering event, but it was a marketing event, and we were hosting, and we had several superintendents from different school districts there. And the marketing gal in our office, her name's Cynthia, she came up to me, she said, "Hey, you wrote this book for kind of first, second grade level. What if we bought a bunch of them and donated them to the schools and had you speak at this event?"
So cool.
And I was like, "Oh, wow. Yeah, I'd love to do that." I didn't make any money from that, but I'm just happy to share. Right. And so there's all these experiences, all these things that I got to do that ultimately, if you look at them from really far away or rather up close, they're not really connected. But when you kind of take a step back and look at the big picture, you realize that there's just different muscles and different skills that I learned in doing that project that are going to make me a better father, a better husband, and a better engineer, right?
Yeah.
And so I just encourage people to exercise those creative juices and creative muscles outside of work. I think we can do it within, our careers as well. But I think it's really important that we're engaged outside of what we do from our 9 to 5.
Yeah. I experience that a lot in my day-to-day. So I work for Simpson Strong Tie, so we get questions on connectors.
Cool. I didn't know
quite
that.
A lot. And so often it's like somebody calls with a question, or I should say not a question, but like a situation, and they're trying to find a connector. And maybe we don't make something specific for that application, but it's like, you kind of get your wheels turning. Well, like, what if we were to use this, or how could we apply this other thing, and like think through it, and could it be used in this application as well? So it's kind of like you have to start thinking just in a more creative way to come up with a solution. And I think that's the same when you're in design. You got to figure out new ways to solve maybe the same problem, but the same solution won't work. So.
Yeah. And I think, kind of piggybacking off that idea, I think anybody that's been in engineering more than a decade starts to realize that there's this other game being played of business development and bringing in work and building relationships with clients that in many ways has nothing to do with what we learned in school, the technical aspect of building codes and all the math that we learned and the software that we use, all that stuff. Now we've got to be, with people. We have to have these people skills. And my experience has been that those things aren't talked about enough or encouraged enough early in our careers. I know there's this big focus on like getting trained and getting the technical acumen and being an engineer first. And I'm not saying that shouldn't be the priority, but you get later in your career and you realize that there's all these other things to deal with as far as on the people level and the client level. And so, again, I think if we can do some of these things outside of the workplace, we're just going to be better suited for later down the road when we're more client facing and having to have these people skills, right? I'll be honest, engineers are not known for their people skills for the most part.
Yeah, it's a reputation that we have.
It's a reputation.
Yeah.
So if we can encourage that on the front end, and I don't know that needs to be something that our employers necessarily take the lead on. I think that's up to the individual, right?
Yeah.
And so we talk a lot about that in the coaching that I do about just, your boss doesn't have to hold your hand with everything that you do. Like you can take charge of your own life and you can do these creative projects and find that they're really fulfilling and you learn a lot. So yeah. I think it's important.
Yeah. I think the soft skills is like, it's a huge part of what you need.
Sure.
Just to continue on. But what about, so as an engineer and a coach, what role does self-discipline play in maintaining a strong personal foundation? I know you talked about waking up at 5 a.m, and that's obviously some self-discipline, but how does that come into play and how can engineers build their own disciplines?
Yeah, self-discipline. And, we could talk about this for hours. There's lots of books about it. There's lots of different hacks or approaches. When I was in this weird phase of having got past my SE exam and not knowing what was next and kind of feeling in between, if that's the right way to describe it, just feeling like I don't know what's going to happen next. Am I going to stay here for another 20 years? Am I going to do something else? I did what a lot of people do. I reached out to a mentor and a friend and kind of explained my situation. I said, hey, look, I'm looking to potentially make a change. I don't know what that change looks like, but what do you think? And this is a guy much more senior than myself. He'd been around for a while. He's an engineer as well. And he gave me some great advice. I wouldn't even say it's advice. He just gave me some good feedback and kind of lessons learned from his own career. And it helped me. He made some connections with Reaveley. He knew Reaveley and some people that worked there. And in large part, he helped me get this second job where I'm at now. But at the end of our conversation, he gave me kind of some of his lessons learned. And he talked about what we all think of as integrity, which is doing what we say we're going to do, right? And that's directly applicable to the business side of engineering. Like we tell a client, will be done by a certain day. We got to do that thing, right? And be done. But I think over the last couple of years, what I've realized is that self-discipline is the highest form of integrity, because self-discipline is when we do what we tell ourselves we're going to do. And so we all do this. We're engineers. We plan, we scheme, we figure out how, if weight loss is a thing, then we go, okay, I'm going to work out 5 days a week and I'm going to do these hours. And we make this whole plan. And then when we wake up in the morning, we don't do it. Right. And so we're not keeping our word to ourselves. And so, like I said, I'm not a morning person, but every day when I wake up at 5 to do my read, write, and my run, my 3 hours, right, I immediately think about hitting the snooze button. Like I'm not lying. Like it's always like, oh, this again. Like I don't want to do this again. But then I remind myself of the commitment that I made to myself the night before and the day before and the day before. And am I perfect at it? No, but I'm getting better and better and better. And I want to have more wins than losses, right? And I've learned that no matter what you're doing, a job or being a father or losing weight, all of these things take self-discipline, right? And I think what I've learned is to love what it takes to get what I want. So if I know where I'm headed and what kind of life I want, then along the way, I got to figure out, well, what does it take to get there? And then I have to do those things. And so that's another thing I remind myself every morning. I go, man, I really don't love running, but I love it. I love having gone on a run. Like I love after I'm done, I go, that was good. That was good for me. It's healthy. I feel good. I don't particularly like writing. It's hard. Like it's actually hard to do. But after I've sat down and I've done my writing, I feel good about it, right? And so I don't know if those are necessary tips or tricks, but I think it's just the reality of the situation and facing it for what it is and saying like, hey, I just need to do these things because they're important, right? And if I don't do them, then I'm not keeping my word to myself.
Yeah. So love what it takes to get what you want.
Yes,
I like that.
I love that
saying.
Yeah.
What about one thing we always like to ask our guests is if a lot of the people that listen to this show are newer in their career, and what would you give, like what is the advice that you would have to structural engineers or professionals looking to build that strong foundation that we talked about and kind of support that long-term success in engineering?
Yeah, I love this question as well. What I would say, my first thought is we've been talking a lot about kind of personal growth and personal development, things you can do like within the walls of your own home at 5 a.m. and things that you're going to work on. I think a lot of times we take that information, we internalize it, and we kind of try to do it on our own. And my biggest piece of advice for somebody of any age, but particularly somebody younger, just starting in their career, is to not do it alone. And what I mean by that is look for someone that's a few years ahead of where you're at right now and use them as a coach or a mentor. Pick their brain about things, see what they've done. Don't necessarily look for advice, but like lessons learned or the wisdom that they've gained over the years, things that they do that help them. And this could be directly applicable to their career, but also more importantly to all these things that we're talking about right now, as far as like building the life that you want. In the coaching that I do, that's my favorite part. Those are my favorite people to work with are people that are like 2 or 3 years behind where I'm at. And the reason is because they're hungry for that next step. Sometimes if you have a mentor that's 40 years older than you, although they have a plethora of wisdom and lessons learned, sometimes it just feels like the gap is too big and there's a disconnect there. And so I think the best mentors are typically people that are just a little bit ahead of where we're at. And so that would be my advice. We kind of covered what I consider the fundamentals today. So like the basic concepts of the things that we talked about. I think there's some fulfillments with those, or rewards is what I call them. And so ultimately, if you do things like own the morning, where you come up with some sort of morning routine that's for you, you spend time writing every day to think and go through your thoughts and refine those thoughts, and then figure out these creative projects that you can work on. I think the promise or the reward is that we'll all be less busy, or actually we'll feel less busy because we're getting more of what we want done. And then the flip for me was I started doing all these things and I started to be excited when I woke up about the day ahead, as opposed to just like, oh, another day, another dollar, you know? And so I think that's the promise, is that we'll wake up excited and ready to work hard. There's this quote by a guy named Jim Rohn. I don't think he's alive anymore. He was kind of Tony Robbins' predecessor, but he has this quote. He says, if you work hard on your job, you can make a living. If you work hard on yourself, you can make a fortune. And I think that's what I try to instill in people, because it's worked for me. Like, I feel much more blessed and benefited by, like we talked about, making the strong column or the strong foundation of my life and where I want it to go, and then have these other things kind of branch off from there. And I think everyone will find that that's true as well. I do want to throw in, just before we get off, I don't know if you have any more questions, but I do have a website for my coaching. It's humanengineercoach.com. There's a bunch of free resources there. So I have a PDF that kind of summarizes what we talked about today with some of these fundamentals that you can download. I also have a weekly newsletter that goes out every Friday that talks about personal development for engineers and technical professionals. Again, that's a free resource. And then if anybody's even interested with chatting with me, I love doing a free call and just seeing if I can help in any regard. So yeah, that's the gist of it.
We'll definitely add that information and the resource to the podcast when we publish it.
I appreciate that.
I was going to say also, in terms of owning the morning, I think your advice for people, or your tips, is a great thing. It definitely like sets the tone for the day in terms of like fulfillment, right? So like some days, you know, you wake up, you roll over and you immediately look at your work phone and start looking at emails, and your mind can start racing about all the things you need to do. And then, you know, or you wake up and you do go on the treadmill for a half an hour, and you have all this time to think and not be, you know, bogged down with all the busyness of things. And then when you finally just go and start work, you're like, oh, okay, like I can do this. So I know that's my experience as well.
Awesome.
So I think that's a great tip for people that maybe haven't thought about those options yet.
Yeah, I love that. That's great.
So, all right. Well, Jake, thank you so much for, you know, sharing all of this with us. I also, what is your book called? We'll put this on the podcast too, but I'm curious.
It's on Amazon. It's called The Difficult Life of a Little Brown Hound.
Okay. And what's the lesson that you were wanting your son to learn?
I'll be quick, but it's when my wife and I had our first son, and this was 10 years ago, we knew that it was going to turn our world upside down for good and bad, right? Like, it's just a different lifestyle when you're not a parent, and then all of a sudden you're a parent. You don't know what you're doing. Like, you're trying to figure it out. So the story is that experience of going from no children to children, but it's written from the perspective of our dog, the little brown hound.
Oh.
And so we had him before we had kids. He's still around. He's like 14 years old. And it's written like his life was so great because we, you know, babied him and pampered him and took him on walks, and he was like our kid for the most part. And then all of a sudden we had our son, and he kind of got the boot, right? Like he didn't get as much attention, and walks were a lot less. And so he goes through this period of thinking, man, this kid, like, I don't want him around. This change is not good. But in the end, they're best friends, right? And so the moral of the story is to embrace change, and that we can find unexpected, blessings and experiences that may be tough in the moment,
Awesome.
So,
okay, I'll have to check that out.
Yeah, thanks. That's great.
Very cool. Okay, yeah. So thank you so much for joining us. Thanks for sharing all your insights, and it's been a pleasure having you on the podcast.
Hey, it's been great. Thanks, Rachel. I had a great time.
I hope you enjoyed the episode today. We would love to hear your feedback, comments, and/or questions. To leave them, please visit structuralengineeringchannel.com. There you'll find the summary of the key points discussed in today's episode, as well as links to any of the resources or websites mentioned during it. Don't forget to subscribe to Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. Until next time, we wish you the best in all of your structural engineering endeavors.